We're excited to have you join us for the Come Follow Me 2021 podcast and study of the Doctrine and Covenants, hosted by Rod Meldrum and Jonathan Neville, and presented by Gospel Doctrine Answers. In today's podcast, we will study Doctrine and Covenants 29, Jesus Christ will gather his people.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's podcast, and I tell you what, this is going to be a special one. In fact, it's going to be so special that we're going to have to make it into two separate podcasts. So I have with me today, we have David Reed joining us from Michigan. He's expert on lots of different things, but I want to introduce him as a DNA resident expert. But also, he is the son of my dear friend, Lynette Hadley Reed. And she has just been a delight. She's spoken at numerous of our conferences. But this is her son, David. And David is a patent attorney, and he's also a judge. And we are very grateful to have him. He has spent literally the last several years and researching and studying and giving further information in regard to the DNA information and research that I kind of started off and kind of cut my teeth with, and then he has been doing independent research from my research, and I think you're going to find this to be really just fascinating. So I'm excited about what we're going to be sharing with you. To begin with, then, again, we have our Come Follow Me manuals. Basically, this is lesson number 13. This is Doctrine and Covenants section 29 is where we're going to be focusing on part A. There's going to be a two-part podcast here. And then there's going to be Easter coming up. And we have a special treat for you coming up for Easter. Basically, it's a last days timeline, which is something that was recorded back in December with the Sisters of Liberty, and talking about the timeline of the last days and some of the signs and things, which also we're going to be talking about here in section 29 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And then we're going to follow up with part B. This is going to be the April the 5th to the 11th after Easter. This is Doctrine and Covenants sections 30 to 36. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. But there's things that are talked about in these sections of the Doctrine and Covenants that are really profound and have some real implications to the Book of Mormon. So I'm going to put that away. Last week we talked a little bit about section 28 in the Doctrine and Covenants, where the Lord commanded Oliver Cowdery, or he actually commanded Joseph Smith to send Oliver Cowdery on a mission to the Lamanites. In section 29, he's talking a lot about the second coming and things that are going to happen before the second coming. And in verse 14 he says, But behold, I say unto you that before this great day shall come. And then he starts with a whole litany, a list of things that are going to happen before this great day comes, which he's talking about in verse 8. He says, Wherefore the decree hath gone forth from the Father, and they shall be gathered into one place unto the face of this land, to prepare their hearts and to prepare and be prepared in all things against the day when tribulation and desolation are sent forth upon the wicked. This is talking about the signs just before the second coming here. And I'll talk about that. Well, let's just go ahead and kind of handle that right now before I bring David in here, because we're going to have a really awesome discussion here with David about on the DNA side of things on the Book of Mormon. There are several things that are talked about here in verse 14 and through about verse 23. He talks about great day shall come, and the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall be turned into blood. I don't think that's talking about hemoglobin, but we'll talk about blood moons and so forth. And the stars shall fall from heaven. There shall be greater signs in heaven above and in the earth beneath. There shall be weeping and wailing among the hosts of men, and there shall be great hailstorms sent forth to destroy the crops of the earth. All of these things are going to be talked about over the Easter break, basically, or the Easter podcast, which, by the way, is going to be 4 hours long. It's a presentation that was done for the Sisters of Liberty. And that's going to also be broken into two pieces. But we'll talk about all of this, the great hailstorm. This is talking about the signs just before the second coming here. Well, let's just go ahead and kind of handle that right now before I bring David in here, because we're going to have a really awesome discussion here with David on the DNA side of things on the Book of Mormon. But so there's several things that are talked about here in verse 14 and through about verse 23. He talks about a great day shall come, and the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall be turned into blood. I don't think that's talking about hemoglobin, but we'll talk about blood moons and so forth. And the stars shall fall from heaven. There shall be greater signs in heaven above and in the earth beneath. There shall be weeping and wailing among the hosts of men, and there shall be great hailstorms sent forth to destroy the crops of the earth. All of these things are going to be talked about over the Easter break, basically, or the Easter podcast, which, by the way, is going to be 4 hours long. It's a presentation that was done for the Sisters of Liberty, and that's going to also be broken into two pieces. But we'll talk about all of this: the great hailstorm. When does that happen? What is the effect of that? It talks about flies and so forth that take upon them, and all of these things that they're being discussed here in the Doctrine and Covenants. There up until this is through about verse 23 of section 29, talking about a new heaven and a new earth. And then it talks about the archangel Michael, his archangel, shall sound his trump, and so forth. And so all of this just keeps going on through this part of it here. Let's see here. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time here talking about the DNA evidence, which is how I kind of got started with things. And so I'm going to go to a couple of some slides here and kind of give you a little bit of an overview as to how I got involved with this. And then I wanted to have David tell us about how he got involved with this and kind of how these two have kind of merged and actually support each other in this whole DNA realm. So for me, one of the interesting parts that I wanted to know more about is who are the scattered Book of Mormon remnants, and how do we know who these people are? Where did they scatter to, and where are they today? And who is the resident expert that knows all about who these people are, and how can we learn more from them? I'm going to go through this now. I just want to reiterate, though, before we really jump into these slides here, there's several different places where you can go to get this information, because we're going to blast through this really, really at a very high level. So if you want to learn more about it, I'll give you several places that you can go for additional information. One of those is this book I wrote several years ago. It's called Rediscovering the Book of Mormon Remnant Through DNA. This goes into the details about how can we rediscover who this Book of Mormon remnant is, and how can DNA be used in that process. It's about 160, 70 pages or so. There's over 107 references to scientific journals and so forth in here. If you want to have a deep dive in that, you can get the book. If you want to have a physical book, you can buy it from our website. If you want to just get the book, you can download the entire thing for free off of the website. If you go to the downloads page and then just download this particular book, it's all free. So you can just go and you can peruse that. Then after that, then we had the DNA evidence DVD set, which is a 5 DVD set, and the third disc of the 5 DVD set is about a 2-hour presentation on DNA in the Book of Mormon from the research that I was doing at the time. So there's that. You can actually go to that. You can also go to the streaming. If you're watching this on the streaming website, you can actually go to with the streaming website. There's probably 5 or 6 different presentations that involve DNA and those kinds of things that you can go there. If you happen to be one of those who has the number one book in the church on the subject of the evidences of the Book of Mormon, which is this Exploring the Book of Mormon in America's Heartland, if you have that, you can open that book up, and it has quite a bit of information here on page 50 about the missions to the Lamanites, which we're going to be talking about here today, and also the Lamanite Mission Report. And then on page 52 and 53, it talks about the visits of the Sac and the Fox Indians to Joseph Smith. We're going to just touch on that just briefly. And then pages 54 and 55 actually talk about the DNA evidence for the Book of Mormon based on, this is a number of years ago. This is before David's DNA research came on board. So this is we need to update this with David's information, actually. And then also, if you have the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon, then right towards the back here, there's a whole another section here about American Indian DNA studies and DNA genetics and so forth. This is a little more up to date and has a little bit more information about the haplogroup rDNA and so forth that we're going to be talking about. So there's some resources for you. Many of you probably already have some of these books and so forth, so you can just refer to those books and DVDs. Okay, now, so David, we're going to get you in here. I promise in just a minute here. But so what I thought,
whenever you're ready,
just to do a quick little overview as to the DNA research that I did. And I'm just going to let you basically go to all of these different sources for additional information. So I'm just going to be just touch on the very basics here, so we can get to David's brand new DNA research. So back to the slides for just a second here. So there are promises that have been made to the house of Israel that they will not be destroyed. This is 2 Nephi chapter 9, verse 53. It says, He has promised unto us that our seed shall not utterly be destroyed according to the flesh. That means there's going to be a physical remnant left. And He would preserve them in future generations. They shall become a righteous branch unto the house of Israel. In 2 Nephi chapter 30, verse 4, it says, And then shall the remnant of our seed know concerning us how that we came out of Jerusalem, and that they are descendants of who? The Jews. So how are they going to know that they're descendants of the Jews? Doctrine and Covenants section 3 says that the purpose why the plates was preserved was so that the promises of the Lord could be fulfilled, which He made to His people, and that the Lamanites might come to the knowledge of their fathers. Who are their fathers? Well, who are the Lamanites is the big question. And that they might know the promises of the Lord and then believe in the gospel and come back into the fold. So what are the promises? Basically, the covenant promises and judgments involve a land, posterity, prosperity, and security, which I've talked about over and over again. But the Lamanite promises actually are dealing with this. Their seed will not be destroyed, according to the flesh. They'll come to a knowledge of their Jewish ancestry, their Jewish heritage. And number 3, that they're going to return to the gospel as a righteous branch. So those are some of the Lamanite promises. Well, that brought me to a question about, what did Joseph Smith know about all of this? What did he know about the geography of the Book of Mormon and who maybe these people were? It turns out that in these sections that we just, last week we did that section 28, where Oliver Cowdery was commanded by the Lord to Joseph Smith to go unto the Lamanites. And then in section 30, which we're going to be talking about today, so I'm going to go ahead and read this. It says, this is section 30, verses 5 and 6. It says, Behold, I say unto you, Peter Whitmer, Jr., that you shall take your journey with your brother Oliver Cowdery, for I have given unto him power to build up my church among whom? The Lamanites. Now, I want to reiterate something here really quickly, and that is that how many of you believe that the Lord knows where and who these Lamanites are, where they went when after the Nephites were wiped out and so forth? How many of you believe that the Lord knows who those remnant people are and where they're located? Because I'm one of those that believes that the Lord knows. And if the Lord knows, then I think we have to pay special attention to these particular passages here in the Doctrine and Covenants here, where it's talking about Oliver Cowdery, Peter Whitmer Jr. Every time in this, the Lord uses the term Lamanites. And I want to reiterate that because we're going to talk just briefly about that for a second. Then in section 32, which is also, this is going to be a part of Part B of this podcast, says, And now concerning my servant Parley P. Pratt, says, He shall go with my servants Oliver Cowdery and Peter Whitmer Jr. into the wilderness among the Lamanites. And that's verses 1 through 2. And then in verse 3, I love this one specifically. So you have Oliver Cowdery, Peter Whitmer Jr., and Parley P. Pratt. And there's another guy by the name of Ziba Peterson, and he also says he will go with them. And then he says this. Now, who's speaking here? This is the Lord speaking in Revelation to the prophet Joseph Smith, right? And he says, And I myself, so this is the Lord, will go with them and be in their midst. I am their advocate with the Father, and nothing shall prevail against them. Now, if that's the case, then that sounds to me like a personal guided tour by the Lord himself these 4 missionaries unto people that the Lord called in every single instance Lamanites. How many of you want to know where they went? I think it'd be critical to know where they went, right? And so this is actually from Parley P. Pratt's autobiography, which was derived from his journals at the time. And he said, thus ended our first Indian mission. This is Parley P. Pratt now telling where they went and who they went to go see when the Lord was directing their footsteps, basically, to the people that the Lord called Lamanites. So thus ended the first Indian mission, in which we had preached the gospel in its fullness and distributed the record of their forefathers among 3 tribes: the Cattaraugus Indians near Buffalo, New York, the Wyandottes of Ohio, and the Delaware, west of Missouri. Now, who are these people? There's many Algonquin tribes, and they include these different people, including the Sac and the Fox and the Ojibwe, and about 110 other tribes. Joseph himself then, this is now later on August the 12th of 1841, this is from the History of the Church, Volume 4. He says, I accordingly went down and met with Kikukush, Apanus, and about 100 chiefs and braves of the Sac and the Fox tribes with their families. Joseph Smith then said, I conducted them to the meeting grounds in the grove and instructed them in many things which the Lord had revealed unto me concerning who? Concerning their fathers, and the promises that were made concerning them in the Book of Mormon. Here Joseph Smith is making it absolutely clear that the people that he's meeting with, that he claims that he had been revealed to him, that the Book of Mormon was the record of their fathers, their ancestors. And this is completely consistent with the Lord sending the first 4 missionaries ever to be. In fact, they had the very first copies of the Book of Mormon that just came off the Grandin Press. That they went before they were sent to Europe or anywhere else. The first place that the Lord sent the very first missionaries of this dispensation was to people that the Lord called Lamanites, and they were these tribes. Now, some people have said that Joseph Smith, originally he thought that the people here in North America, the North American Indians, were the Lamanites, but then later on he changed his mind. And thought that, and began to believe that the Mayans down in Central America, or the Incas, or one of these other great civilizations down there, was actually the Lamanites. That can be refuted, though. I should say that argument can be ended by this entry from Joseph Smith in his own personal diary of Thursday, May the 23rd of 1844. This was only a month before Joseph was assassinated or killed. And this is what he wrote in his journal. He says, at 1 p.m., he said, I held counsel with the Indians. Now, he's in Nauvoo at the time. He said, the Sac and the Fox in my back kitchen. He says, I replied, the Great Spirit wants you to be united and live in peace. He says, I found a book and presented him with the Book of Mormon, which told me about your fathers, and the Great Spirit told me. Who, brothers and sisters, is the Great Spirit? It's Christ. Right? And so Christ told Joseph Smith that the book, meaning the Book of Mormon, right here, that this book was the book about the of the ancestral people here of America. And I find that that's just absolutely compelling. Joseph Smith did not change his mind from his earlier revelations or these first 4 missionaries. He was completely consistent throughout his entire life. And a month before he was killed, he is again with the Indians in his kitchen there in Nauvoo, and telling them that the Book of Mormon is about them and their ancestors. And by the way, they're not related to the Mayans. There's a couple of other scriptures here in Doctrine and Covenants, section 54. Newell Knight says, take your journey into the regions westward to the land of Missouri, to the borders of the Lamanites. So Missouri, USA is the border of the Lamanites. And then also in section 28, we just talked about that, but he talks about the city of Zion being on the border of the Lamanites as well. So where is this border of the Lamanites? Well, it's not in Guatemala, and it's not southern Mexico. It's here in the northern part of, or in the midwestern part of the United States. So again, let's go back to the question, who are the scattered Book of Mormon remnants, and where do they scatter to? Well, we know about the Hopewell Mound Builder people. They had kind of 4 major concentrations of areas where they lived. We know that they brought materials from all over the entire interior of America to the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River valleys. They brought all kinds of influence and had all kinds of archaeological things that basically match up with the Book of Mormon. These are some geographic map anchors, which we're not going to go over, and this is what we feel is the geography, the chronological history of the Book of Mormon here. We're not going to go into any of that. The DNA model, this to me became a real issue when there was this DVD that came out in 2002, 2003 called DNA versus the Book of Mormon. It became a very personal thing to me, and I've told this story numerous times, but I'll just very quickly. I had a family, a young man. I was the young man's president of our ward, and I had this young man who was supposed to be going on a mission and wasn't. And his family moved out. His mom showed up a few days after we helped them move with this DVD in her hand and said, "Brother Meldrum, you need to watch this DVD." And I said, "Why is that?" And she said, "Because it's true." And their family was in the process of, or she and the kids were in the process of leaving the church over this DVD. And so it became a very personal thing to me. I wanted to find out, number one, as you know, if you've listened to me, these podcasts and so forth for a while, I have a deep testimony of the Book of Mormon that began from way, way back, but then it was really solidified on my mission. So it doesn't really matter to me if there's ever any evidence for the Book of Mormon physically. I know there's going to be evidence because I know it's true automatically, because I know it's true spiritually. So the DNA evidence basically here, I wanted to find out what was the evidence for it. Well, the conclusion from this DVD was basically if the book is fiction, then its characters are fiction and the whole thing is fiction. In the DVD, they actually have an interview with President Hinckley, where this German reporter during the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City came and asked President Hinckley and says, "What's going to be your position when DNA analysis will show that in the history never has been an emigration from Israel to North America?" He says it could be that the scientists will find out, and then President Hinckley actually kind of cut him off right there. He says, "Wait, that hasn't happened. That hasn't been determined yet. All I can say is that's speculative. No one really knows that, the answer to that, not at this point." Now, I submit to you that this is a prophet of God speaking, and he nailed it. He was absolutely right. It wasn't yet time, but 1 year after he made this statement in 2002 and 2003, articles began to show up in all kinds of journals and so forth, talking about a DNA type that was not an Asian DNA type, and I know that David's going to talk a little bit more about this right here, so I'm going to go past that here. But the bottom line is that we have some amazing things that this is what I was finding out, is that essentially when they first began sequencing DNA from Native American populations and throughout North, Central, and South America, they could be categorized into one of 4 specific groups called haplogroups. These were haplogroups A, like for example up in Alaska, the Aleuts. They had haplogroup B in the American Southwest, and C and D were throughout North and South America. And they're all Asian-based. But then, at about 2000, this is actually 1998, they began to find some findings, basically, at the bottom of that says, now a new genetic study may link Native Americans and people of Europe and the Middle East instead of all from Eastern Asia. Then, in the journal Science in 1998, they began to confirm that this particular group, this haplogroup X, which this is what I've been talking about. Basically, haplogroup X is known by 5 specific markers in the DNA that differentiates them from other primary haplogroups. These 5 markers are found in the Native American populations in North America, but not found in Central or South America. But they are found in Europe in groups like in Finland and Italy and Israel, and also in Turkey. But the one that really caught my eye was the Israel part. There's this DNA type indicated by 5 markers that's found in Israel. and it's not found in central Siberia, which was thought to be where that would have come from. It turns out that there are 5 founding haplogroups that are even understood to. This is held all the way till today, even now. These are the primary 5 haplogroups of Native Americans throughout the Americas. In U.S. News and World Report in 2001, they started talking about that there was Ojibwe and other tribes living near the Great Lakes. The markers were not found in any other Native Americans or in Asia. They weren't Asian. It says, we don't know how it got here, but it's clearly related to Europeans instead of to Asians. This is the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 2002. This is the first journal article, one of the first journal articles that I ever found that's going to involve a guy that Dave is going to be talking about in more detail here in just a minute. That's Kennewick Man. And then we have Evolutionary Anthropology in 2003. They said there was 2 individuals from a 700-year-old cemetery in West Central Illinois, and they had the same sequences as Algonquins from the Great Lakes region, and those people are haplogroup X, which is also found in populations of Israel. These are some of the tribes that we're talking about in the introduction to the Book of Mormon. They talked about the principal ancestors of that originally, and then they changed that to among the ancestors in the introduction to the Book of Mormon. So not everybody who is a Native American person in the Americas is actually Book of Mormon related. There are populations that have nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. In South and Central America, they found that the haplogroup X is not present in any samples that they were showing up until that point, and it's only been found in North American populations. And we don't have time to go into all the details about all of this, but bottom line is, going to get through this. They found out that there's 2 subgroups of this haplogroup X DNA type. Haplogroup X1 is found primarily in northern Africa, and X2 is found in essentially Israel and the eastern portion of the United States is the primary location where these 2 groups are found. There's a population of Druze over in Israel that they don't intermarry outside of their people, and because of that, they have become a genetic, what they call a refugium, basically, which is it's a snapshot of the ancient DNA history of the ancient Israelites, and they find that they also have this haplogroup X DNA type. This is Dr. Donald Yates, PhD. He's the founder of DNA Testing Systems out of Tempe, Arizona. He says the mystery of haplogroup X was revealed in a very important study by a team under Dr. Schlutz, and he determined without any doubt that the origin of haplogroup X was the hills of Galilee. He says it was that clear. So that's where the origin of this haplogroup X came from that happens to be here in these Native Americans in North America. We're not going to talk about the X2 DNA and so forth too much more. I'm just going to say that the distribution is really fascinating, and I think David's going to cover that in more detail here. So to finish up, basically, we have several different groups of Jews around the world. This is talking about the different Ashkenazi Jews, which is the largest population of Jews in the world. They have haplogroup X. The Iraqi Jews, the Libyan Jews, the Moroccan Jews, the Tunisian Jews. Every diverse Jewish population that has been scattered around the world has these 5 markers, which just happen to be found in the Ojibwe, the Sac and the Fox, the Penobscot, over 110 tribes of this Algonquin-speaking language groups, which includes here in the West, for those of you who live in the western part of the United States, the Sioux and the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, they all have these same 5 markers, and no one knows how it was that these markers just happen to show up here. They're not Asian, they are European, and they stem from the hills of Galilee. So there we go. That's in fact, this has been such a big deal in National Geographic. They said, great surprise, Native Americans have West Eurasian origins, and they actually said that nearly 1/3 of Native American genes come from West Eurasian people who are linked to the Middle East and Europe, i.e. Israel, rather than entirely from East Asians as previously thought, according to a newly sequenced genome. That's from National Geographic in 2013. So the only thing that basically becomes an issue then is the dating, and we don't have time to go into the dating of that. You can refer back to this other reference material that we have here. For the dating, I'll just say that the dating has major issues with it, with two different types of dating. One that's actually observable and one of them that's theoretical. And when you understand the difference between the two, then you understand what's going on here. So to finish up my little part of it here, the primary explanation from LDS scholars of why no DNA evidence has been found in Mesoamerica is because, well, they say, well, we don't know what we're looking for. Well, it's true. We don't have an actual sample from Lehi or Sariah or his, or Ishmael or his wife or whatever. But we do know what they aren't. We know that they were Hebrews. We know they were through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know that means that all of the Asiatic people they're not Asians. We know that they're not Africans, okay, because that's not who their ancestry are. So we may not know exactly what we're looking for, but we know at least what they're not, and we definitely know a lot about what we are looking for because we can look at those ancient populations of the Middle East. Number 2, it says Lehi's group was a drop in the genetic bucket of an ancient American DNA lineages and was diluted out of existence. Basically, the thought is when Lehi arrived on the Promised Land, he and his family immediately assimilated into a much larger, broader population of people, and they're promoting the Central America theories. So they basically moved in with the Mayans, and then because of that, they intermarried with the Mayans, and then their DNA basically got diluted out of existence. The only problem with that is that completely ignores the storyline of the Book of Mormon itself, which talks about how Nephi and those who followed him went up into the land of Nephi. They made Nephi the king. They were commanded not even to intermarry with their own brethren. Hebrew populations are taught basically not to intermarry with outside groups either. And so here they are in the land of Nephi for almost 600 years, multiplying and replenishing with zero evidence whatsoever that they were intermarrying or intermixing with any other culture or any other people. So that basically doesn't work. The last thing is that the Book of Mormon populations were eliminated through genetic bottlenecks. Basically, a genetic bottleneck could be, for example, the Nephites, they had a genetic bottleneck because they all got wiped out around 400 AD. But their brethren, the Lamanites, they never did get wiped out. So there is no genetic bottleneck that would basically eliminate any evidence for the Lamanites and their civilization carrying forward, and we know that they lived. So these explanations from LDS scholars who promote the Central America theories, they don't really hold water. Okay, so we've addressed those things, and again, they're just the promises that there will be a remnant that will be remaining on the house of Israel, and the bottom line is Joseph knew. Now, David, you've been very patient here as I've kind of gone through my little rendition here. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes and have you tell me a little bit more about how you began your research and what was happening with that.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, just so everyone knows, Rod and I are completely independent in terms of independent of each other in terms of research that we've done. But it was actually through Rod that I started to research the DNA. My mother had come across his materials and the DVDs in particular related to the DNA evidence and had become interested in that. And she shared them with me. And I reviewed those and started looking more into the information. I read Rod's material. I watched his material. I also read the materials written by critics, both in the church and out of the church, related to Rod's material. And just an aside, there were some criticisms that were pretty unfair. They were pretty unfair and unjust to Rod in, personal attacks and things. But nevertheless, I became interested in the subject, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out for myself what the science really said. So I embarked on my own journey to look at the primary sources, to look at the scientific research it for myself, and find out what the science really said. And I was prepared for an answer that there was no evidence. I mean, that was actually one of the arguments that, some of the ones from BYU and the church were saying, for example, is that we can't expect to find the DNA. So I was prepared for that answer, that there was no evidence of DNA evidence for the Book of Mormon. But that's not what I found. And what I found as I went to the scientific journals and I read the articles and, hundreds of hours, thousands of pages of that kind of stuff. And what I found is that Rod was right in terms of the haplogroup X, that there are these lines for this for the haplogroup X, it's the matrilineal line. So it's the mother's mother, mother, mother. And it's on that line, as Rod indicated, there are 5 lines, and 4 of them appear Asian in origin, but one of them doesn't. And when you look at where it occurs in the old world, the best fit, like Rod said, is the Middle East. It's the place that has the greatest variety of it, the greatest concentration of it. And the science is actually pretty clear that it comes from the Middle East. And now the critics say, well, it must have come from the Middle East through Asia then. Because they don't want to let go of the Bering Strait migration theory for those people. But the fact is that there's no trail of evidence across Siberia. And so there's no evidence supporting that. And it's really kind of unrealistic to think that they, went across Asia and left no DNA evidence behind as they migrated. So yeah, the closest location, the closest relatives to the haplogroup X that you find in Native Americans in the Northeast North America, the closest relative is in the Middle East. And, actually, surprisingly, another thing I found was that, among the Native Americans who have haplogroup X, there's actually 2 subtypes of that. There's a haplogroup X2A, and that's the main type. Mm-hmm. And then there's a small group, X2G. And the X2G is right there in some of the same tribes in the Ojibwa, in particular, with X2A. And so it's clear they're, common ancestry for those 2 types. But it turns out that X2A, the dominant type, is actually closer related genetically to the Middle Eastern type, so type X2J in the Middle East, than it is to the other Native American X2G type. So it's actually pretty strong connection to the Middle East. The other thing I found as I went through the evidence was that there are other DNA, there's other DNA evidence and also blood type evidence that corroborates and fits with the haplogroup X evidence. In particular,
before you go, let me just jump in for just a second, though. The research that I was doing was primarily back in 2008, and from 2002 or 3 up to about 2008 or 9, and that's when I basically came up with my first DVD and started to share this information with other people. Most of what you were just talking about has happened in what kind of time frame?
Well, there's some that does go back prior to that, but a lot of it has come out since then.
Since then, yeah.
And one of the interesting things that came out too is the Kennewick man testing his haplogroup X, and I'll talk about him a little bit too.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah. So, sorry we're doing this by Zoom, so it's possible I'll have some noise that happens in the background as family comes and goes, but hopefully not. We'll see. So with the DNA testing, there's the matrilineal line. There's also a patrilineal line that can be tested. It's on the Y chromosome. So it's only through the males. It's a father, father, father. It's a Y DNA since it's tested. It's DNA that's on the Y chromosome. And when they tested the DNA on the Y chromosome, that Y DNA for Native Americans, what they found was that there are 3 main lines, and 2 of them kind of fit with Asia again. A third line is non-Asian in origin, and so they started to write it off saying, well, this must be European intermixture after Columbus. But what they found in particular in Northeast North America with the Ojibwa and some of those tribes, the Algonquin tribes, is that they were finding so much of it. In some tribes, as much as 60% of the men had this DNA type. They're finding so much of it. And they're also finding out that the DNA was diversely mutated. So it mutated a lot from anything they were finding in Europe. So they were saying, well, okay, this is not an Asian type. We can find it over in Europe and the Middle East and other places like that. But they found that the Native Americans had mutations of it that no longer existed over in the old world, or they couldn't find it over there. Which as many as 8 mutations, and they're saying, well, so they're starting to think maybe it is ancient, because it's a lot of mutations to happen just since Columbus.
Yeah, so it means that basically it's something that's happened a long time ago.
Right.
So that's why they're thinking, well, gosh, it wasn't something that happened just recently.
Right. And so I'm going to share my screen and share a couple of slides with you, and I'm going to show you a little bit where haplogroup X occurs, and then this Y DNA is called Y DNA haplogroup R, where that occurs, and I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So give me just a second here. Okay, hopefully you see that. Do you see that, Ron?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so this first one is haplogroup X globally, and just like Rod said, when you look at, these are of native populations, so when you look at the native populations and where haplogroup X occurs, it's in the among Native Americans in North America, highest concentration in Northeast North America. Mm-hmm. And then in the Old World, the highest concentrations sort of in that Mediterranean area.
Now, one thing before you go, these maps that you're using here, these illustrations, those are not ones that you or I made.
That's correct. Yeah, this was put together by a researcher, and you can just find it right through Wikipedia or other places. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, and then here is a similar one. This is for the Y DNA haplogroup R that I was just talking about, where it's found globally. And as you'll see there, it occurs among Native Americans in Northeast North America primarily. And then it's not, so white means essentially that there is none. So you see through the major East Asian populations, the types of populations that the scientists traditionally think, populated the Americas, it's not found there. Instead, it's found in Caucasian, essentially populations. And Caucasian populations include Europe, Middle East, and some of that Central South Asia area. And so it's definitely a non-Asian type. It's a relatively Caucasian type DNA. And, it ends up, and I'm going to put the in this next slide, the haplogroup X and the Y DNA haplogroup R together. When you put them side by side, it's really clear that it's two separate lines of DNA now, the matrilineal line, the patrilineal line. They both point to the same populations, the same groups that have that non-Asian DNA type. And now the consensus in the science, unfortunately, generally says for the matrilineal line, the haplogroup X on the left, they say, well, we think that came before the Book of Mormon. We think that was, 15, 16,000 years ago, and it's kind of based off of some evolutionary theories and assumptions that they have there. And then on the one on the right, they say, well, we think that came after Columbus. And but actually the evidence is pushing them together. The Y DNA is clearly ancient when you look again at how many have it and how diversely mutated it is. It's not reasonable to think that came from Columbus. And when you look at the two lines together, they clearly point to a common population. And that sort of fits the heartland area, as you said. Now, there's other, you talked a little bit about DNA in other areas. I would say that there is diffuse small levels of a Mediterranean, potentially could be Jewish DNA that's found throughout Americas, but it's a small level, and it's generally written off as having come over post-Columbus. But there was a recent study in 2018 that conceded that the amount that they were seeing was more than what you would expect from just the historical records of what came over since Columbus. So I would say that there is a little bit of DNA evidence showing a signal diffuse, smaller throughout the Americas, but clearly the highest concentration of DNA is right where the heartland area is, like Rod had discussed. I'm going to show that in actually just a second here. Okay, so this is a third type of DNA testing. This is called autosomal DNA testing. And in this type of testing, it's not, the straight matrilineal line or patrilineal line. Instead of it's sort of a panorama of the ancestry, and they sample different parts. And there are types, DNA types that signal from this. And in this slide, African type DNA types, they color with an orange, and that's the bottom left of the slide here. So if they see an African type of DNA, they put an orange there. If it's an East Asian type of DNA, it's this pink. And if it's unique Native American type, which is generally Asian based, it's this purple color. And then there's this Caucasian type DNA, and they color it this bluish type. And it, as I said, it actually covers for Europe, the Middle East, and some Central and South Asia. Not East Asia, not the China and Japan, those top populations, but for some of the Central South Asia, you get these sort of Caucasian DNA types, and they color it blue. And when they've done samples throughout the Americas, what you find is, so here are sample populations throughout the Americas. And what you see is that the Northeast, North America, these Algonquin tribes, a few of the three of these on the far left of the slide, they have much higher levels of this sort of blue non-Asian DNA, autosomal DNA shows up, which fits with what we saw from the matrilineal DNA and the patrilineal DNA. So that fits. But then what you're seeing with the tribes through the rest of the Americas, it's not very much, but you will see little bits of blue through there, right? This sort of non-Asian DNA that's in most, that shows up, not in everyone, but most of these other tribes. And as I said, in 2018, they did, some scientists, non-members, they conceded that what they're seeing was more than would be expected based off of what they just saw from historical records of the conquistadores and the Spanish interactions and stuff. So there's a little bit of interesting thought there in terms of the blood of Lehi having spread around more diffusely. And we don't know all the stories with that. But anyway, going back a little bit to the haplogroup X, as I said, the closest place that it's found, the closest relative for a haplogroup X2A is the Middle Eastern relative, and that's X2J. And it's very rare. It's only been found twice, once both in the Middle East, once in Egypt. It shows a little spot here shown on the map in Egypt by an oasis there. And up at the top right of that map, you see Jerusalem. And then the other one was found in Iran, were the closest relatives to this haplogroup X 2A type. Then just briefly regarding blood types, I wanted to mention as well, because blood types are also something that show ancestry, and that's also something that's been tested. And what they find is that Native Americans have some unique, their blood type distribution is unique. So Native Americans are essentially virtually all type O. And that's different from Asia. It's different from the Asian populations. And so it's yet another point that corroborates the DNA evidence and shows that it's not just an exclusive Asian ancestry, but it's different for the Americas. And in addition to almost all Native Americans being blood type O, there is a particular variant of blood type O, and it's blood type, it's O1V542A. It's a neutral variant. Technically speaking, so it's blood type O. It's just it's got a unique mutation there that can be tracked for ancestry. It doesn't really affect anything functionally for the blood. But throughout the Americas, these tribes will have this blood type variant show up here and there throughout the tribes throughout the Americas. And so it's clearly old and widely distributed. But when they look at the old world, can they find this blood type variant? They don't see it in the large Asian populations. They don't see it in China, Japan, Korea, all these other large Asian populations. Instead, they haven't really found it except for a few isolated spots, and one of those is in the Middle East. That particular one was in Kuwait. So yet there's yet another little piece too, which is interesting with the blood type. Now, I have put, let me stop the screen sharing there. So as I did the research and I found all this, it's kind of been assembled. And then just within the last few months or so, we published this book, The Face of a Nephite. And right there, and this has the details and the citations through it, and you can get it through Rod's website. He's agreed to sell it, thankfully. But we're excited
about it, actually, David. And in fact, this is brand new, so probably I don't think hardly anybody has it at this point in time. But we have a pretty nice stock of those, so you can go onto the website, bookofmormonevidence.org, at the bookstore. Right. I have found it to be absolutely fascinating, and you also had an audio part that was pretty amazing. That I love that too. Yeah,
and I wrote it, and it's written at two levels at the same time. So it's got relatively longish footnotes on each page for those that want to dig into the sources, and so there's the page sites that people can look up the quotes, and they can research on their own for those that are detailed, and those that aren't as interested in that, they can read along. So it kind of covers at two different levels the topic, so hopefully it's accessible for as many people as possible.
There's great news for all of you annual subscribers to the Book of Mormon Evidence streaming site. You receive $15 discount on our upcoming virtual conference starting April 9th. And everyone that registers gets a free Hebrew in the Heartland 2-hour bonus presentation by Rod Meldrum. Watch online anytime, anywhere, on any electronic device. And thank you to all of you for listening and watching, so we can keep creating new exciting content that uplifts, educates, and inspires. Don't miss the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. Virtual tickets on sale at bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com. Viewing begins April 9th.
Hi, I'm Rod Meldrum, and I want to welcome you to the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference, and it's also part of the Firm Foundation Expo. Folks, if you have been watching this research and seen this unfold over the last number of years, last year, as you know, in April, we had to go virtual. Virtual actually has turned out to be a pretty good way to do a conference because it allows you to have full access to everything. In these previous conferences, we've had 5 or 6 speakers at the same time, and if you didn't go to the one that you wanted, or if you couldn't get into the one that you wanted, then you weren't able to see that. We've eliminated that. We can see every single speaker, stop and take care of other things if you want to, and resume again when you want to, all in the streaming video site. So I want to encourage you to come and join us for our 3rd virtual expo. This is going to be in the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. We have some amazing speakers coming up for you, incredible new research. I know Wayne May and many others have gotten a lot of new things that they're going to be sharing with you. So if you'd like to join us, and also you'll have access to most of all our previous conferences and all the talks and the presentations that have been done there. It is the largest repository of information and research on the Book of Mormon that's ever been assembled. So please join us, come and check out the expo, and I think you're going to really enjoy it.
Don't miss the 27th International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. Viewing begins April 9th. Yearly subscribers get a $15 discount at bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com.